Chapter 1: Whispers in the Pines. The battered sign for Camp Hollowbrook creaked on its rusted chains, a painted sun with a too-wide smile flacking away under the real one. Pines, dense and impossibly tall, pressed in on either side of the dirt track, their shadows stretching long and cool even at midday. It was the kind of place parents pictured for idyllic summer adventures: log cabins, a sparkling lake, and the promise of campfire songs. Static, slouched in the passenger seat of his mother's station wagon, saw only potential data points and an escape from suburban monotony. "You got all your gizmos?" his mother asked, her voice tight with the forced cheerfulness she adopted whenever Static's hobbies were mentioned. Static patted the oversized duffel bag at his feet. Everything essential for atmospheric anomaly detection, spectral signature mapping, and audio phenomenon capture. Standard kit. His mother sighed, a small puff of air. "Right. Well, try to make some actual friends this year, sweetie. Not just the ones who talk back from your machines." Static offered a non-committal grunt. Friends were variables he hadn't quite figured out how to quantify. Ghosts, on the other hand, operated on discernible, if esoteric, principles. Camp Hollowbrook's main lodge was a sprawling log structure, its porch populated by counselors in bright yellow shirts, attempting to organize a chaotic influx of children. Static hefted his duffel, the weight familiar and comforting, and scanned the crowd. He was looking for a specific type, someone not entirely absorbed by the manufactured enthusiasm, someone whose eyes might linger a moment too long on the shadows under the eaves. He found her near the archery range, ostensibly examining a quiver of arrows, but her attention was fixed on a dense copse of trees just beyond the camp's perimeter. She was about his age, perhaps a year younger, with dark hair pulled back in a severe ponytail. A worn, leather-bound journal was tucked under her arm. Static approached, his social awkwardness a physical barrier he had to push through. "They say that part of the woods is off-limits," Static said, by way of introduction. His voice was a little too loud. The girl turned, her eyes, a startling, clear gray, assessing him. "They say a lot of things. Most of them are to keep kids from getting lost or stumbling on a hornet's nest." Her voice was quiet, measured. "Or to keep them from finding something else," Static offered. A flicker of interest in her gray eyes. "You're new, I'm lore." She didn't offer a hand. "Static," he gestured vaguely to his bag, "equipment for observing." Lore's gaze dropped to the duffel, then back to his face. "Observing what precisely?" "Anomalies. This camp. It has a history, not the one they print in the brochures." Static had done his preliminary research. Vague mentions of old settlements, land disputes, people vanishing centuries ago. The kind of fertile ground where residual energies often clung. Lore nodded slowly. "The brochures mention Chief Hollowbrook and a peace treaty. They omit the part about the Paris Creek settlement that was here before the camp, before the logging company. The one that disappeared. Every man, woman, and child vanished around 1788. Static's eyebrows went up. "Specifics. Good. My initial sweep showed some elevated EMF readings near the western boundary, close to an old creek bed, consistent with certain types of imprints." Paris Creek, Lore murmured, more to herself than to him. She opened her journal, its pages filled with neat script and hand-drawn maps. The local historical society has a few mentions. Diaries from neighboring settlements spoke of a sudden silence. No smoke from their chimneys for days. When a party went to investigate, they found cold hearths, food on tables. No signs of struggle, just gone. Their first few days at Camp Hollowbrook passed with the usual summer camp rhythms. Watery bug juice, forced camaraderie around crackling fires, the drone of cicadas. Static set up discreet sensors near the periphery of the camp, tiny cameras disguised as birdhouses, audio recorders tucked into knot holes. Lore spent her afternoons in the small, dusty camp library, poring over brittle county histories and faded maps, her journal filling with fresh notes. They met in the evenings, after taps, in the shadow of the old boathouse, comparing findings. "Anything on your gadgets static?" Lore would ask, her voice a low hum against the chirp of crickets. Fluctuations, spikes in geomagnetic activity around 3 a.m. near the old creek. Some EVP captures, but they're noisy. Could be infrasound, could be something else. He showed her a waveform on his tablet, a jagged peak amidst digital noise. "This I can't explain. It's a rhythmic pattern, almost like chanting, but incredibly faint. Below human hearing range mostly." Lore traced a line on one of her hand-drawn maps. "The creek you mentioned. It matches the approximate location of the Paris Creek settlement's main well, according to an 1802 surveyor's notes I found." One afternoon, during a mandatory nature hike, their group was led by a young counselor named Skip, whose enthusiasm barely masked his summer job boredom. Skip pointed out various trees and bird calls, his voice echoing slightly in the dense woods. "And over there," Skip announced, gesturing vaguely towards a particularly dark section of forest, "that's where Old Man Hemlock used to have his cabin. They say he was a hermit, some say a witch. Anyway, it's off-limits, unstable ground." Lore and Static exchanged a quick glance. Unstable ground was often code for something else entirely. Later, as the group rested by a small waterfall, Lore noticed something carved into an old beech tree, almost swallowed by bark. It was a crude symbol, a circle with a jagged line through it. "Static," she whispered, nudging him. He brought up his camera, zooming in. "Weathered, old, definitely not recent." "I've seen this before," Lore said, flipping through her journal. She stopped at a smudged sketch. From a footnote in a reverend's diary dated 1790, he described it as a mark of the lost, found near places of unusual sorrow or disappearance. That evening the air grew heavy. A thick, unnatural stillness settled over Camp Hollowbrook. The usual symphony of crickets and frogs was muted, replaced by an oppressive silence that pressed against Static's eardrums. He checked his atmospheric sensors, barometric pressure steady, no storm incoming. Yet the hairs on his arms stood on end. Lore found him by the boathouse, her face pale in the moonlight. "You notice it, right?" "The silence," Static confirmed. "And my EMF meters are spiking, all of them, even the one near my bunk." "Something is different tonight," Lore stated. "I was reading by the lake, the water. It looked like it was reflecting a different sky, darker, with stars I didn't recognize. She shivered. Then, for a moment, I thought I saw figures standing on the far bank, tall, too still. Static adjusted the strap of his primary recording unit. It was a custom rig with multiple microphones and a low-light camera. The area near Paris Creek. We need to go. Now. Lore nodded, her expression grim. This feels like what the old texts call a resonance, when the past bleeds through. They moved through the darkened camp like shadows themselves, avoiding the wandering beam of the night watchman's flashlight. The path to the western boundary was narrow, overgrown. The silence persisted, amplifying the snap of every twig underfoot, the rustle of their own clothing. As they neared the old creek bed, a faint smell reached them, wood smoke, and something else, something metallic and unsettling. Static's handheld EMF meter whined, the needle jerking erratically. Readings are off the charts. This is unprecedented. They pushed through a final curtain of ferns and stopped. The creek bed was mostly dry, a scar in the earth littered with smooth stones. But the air here was colder, substantially colder, and the smell of smoke stronger. Lore gripped Static's arm. Look. Faintly, as if projected onto a screen of mist that wasn't there, an image flickered. A rudimentary log cabin, its windows glowing with a soft, orange light. Smoke curled from its chimney. The image was translucent, wavering like heat haze, but it was undeniably there. Static raised his camera, his hand surprisingly steady. It's starting. A low sound drifted from the phantom cabin. A woman's voice, humming a tuneless, mournful melody. The sound was thin, ethereal, yet it scraped at their nerves. Then another figure flickered into view beside the cabin. Small, child-sized. Its face was turned away, but there was something wrong with its proportions, its stillness. It stood there, a darker patch in the already dim light, before slowly turning its head towards them. They couldn't see a face clearly, just a blur. But on the side of its indistinct head, a darker mark, like a smeared handprint made of ash. The humming stopped. The orange glow in the phantom cabin windows snuffed out. The air temperature plummeted further. Static's breath hitched. Lore squeezed his arm tighter, her nails digging into his skin. The small, marked figure raised a hand, its movements jerky, unnatural. It pointed not at them but deeper into the woods, along a path that wasn't there a moment ago, a path that seemed to writhe with shadows. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the vision, the cabin, the marked child, the phantom sounds vanished. The temperature returned to normal. The smell of smoke faded. Only the oppressive silence remained. Static lowered his camera, his screen showing only the dark, empty creek bed. Did you see that? Lore was staring at the spot where the child had been, her face a mask of shock and dawning horror. It saw us. It knew we were watching. Static checked his recorder. The audio was a mess of static, but underneath it, for a brief moment, a faint, childlike whisper, too clear to be an artifact. It said a single word, a word that made the blood run cold in Static's veins. Welcome. He looked at Lore. Her eyes reflected a terror that mirrored his own. The whispers in the pines had become a greeting. Camp Hollowbrook was not just haunted, It was aware, and it seemed to be inviting them in. The summer had just taken a very different turn. The path the child indicated still seemed darker, more defined than the surrounding undergrowth. It was an invitation they both knew, with a chilling certainty, they were going to accept. Static reviewed the footage. The child's image was a blur, the pointing hand indistinct, but the audio of that whisper, it was there, proof, or perhaps a lure. The recordings, Static managed, his voice raspy. The whisper, it's there. Lore nodded, her gaze fixed on the now vanished path. It's not just an echo, Static. It's an invitation, and I don't think it's one we can refuse if we want answers. The silence of the woods pressed in, no longer empty but waiting. Chapter 2: The Preacher's Shadow. The next morning, Camp Hollowbrook awoke to a perfectly ordinary summer day. Sunlight dappled through the pines, children's laughter echoed from the mess hall, and the counselors blew whistles with manufactured zeal. The oppressive silence of the previous night, the spectral cabin, the marked child, they felt like fragments of a shared, disturbing dream. Except for the undeniable recording on Static's device and the lingering chill in Lore's bones. They met after breakfast by the archery targets, the previous night's encounter an unspoken weight between them. Static had barely slept, replaying the faint whisper, enhancing audio, trying to isolate frequencies. Lore's journal was open on her lap, but her pen was still. "The path," Lore said, her voice low. "The one it pointed to. It wasn't on any of the camp maps I've seen, not even the old survey plats." Static nodded. "I cross-referenced GPS coordinates from my sensor near the creek with satellite imagery. There's dense undergrowth where we saw it. No discernible trail. It was manifested." "Or revealed," Lore corrected softly. "Maybe it's always there, just not always visible." She tapped her journal. "Some old legends talk about spirit trails or trods, paths that only open at certain times or for certain people. For people it wants to lead somewhere," Static concluded, the implication hanging heavy. Their routine investigation now felt inadequate, almost naive. Capturing EVPs and mapping EMF fields was one thing. Being directly acknowledged by a centuries-old spectral entity was another. The game had changed. They were no longer just observers. That afternoon, under the guise of a personal orienteering exercise, they made their way back to the Paris Creek area. The woods felt different in the daylight, less overtly menacing but imbued with a quiet watchfulness. The air near the creek bed was still cool, the ground strangely barren where the phantom cabin had stood. There was no sign of the path the marked child had indicated. "It's gone," Static said, sweeping the area with a thermal camera. "No residual temperature differential, no trail." Lore ran her hand over the rough bark of an ancient oak near the creek. "Perhaps it only appears when the resonance is strong enough, like last night." "So we wait for another invitation," Static frowned. "I'd prefer a more proactive approach." He began to deploy a series of wide-spectrum motion sensors, miniature devices that could be easily concealed in the undergrowth. "If anything manifests here, or if that path reappears, we'll get an alert." As dusk began to settle, casting long, distorted shadows, They heard a commotion from the direction of the main camp. Raised voices, a sharp cry. They exchanged uneasy glances and hurried back. A small group of junior campers was huddled near the edge of the woods, close to where Skip had warned them about Old Man Hemlock, supposed cabin. One little girl was sobbing, pointing a trembling finger into the trees. Skip was trying to comfort her, his usual forced cheerfulness strained. "What happened?" Lore asked, approaching cautiously. Skip looked up, relieved to see older campers. "Penny here says she saw a scary man in the woods, a tall man in old clothes." "He had no face," Penny wailed, burying her head in Skip's yellow shirt. "Just dark." Static's attention sharpened. "Where exactly?" Skip pointed. "Just in there by that big, twisted pine. She was looking for her lost hair ribbon." Static and Lore moved towards the indicated area. The woods here were particularly dense, the trees older, their branches intertwined like skeletal fingers. A peculiar stillness hung in the air, similar to the night before, though less intense. "EMF is elevated," Static murmured, checking his handheld meter. "Not as high as the creek, but definitely anomalous." Lore scanned the ground, her eyes sharp. "No footprints, but look." She pointed to a low-hanging branch. Snagged on a sharp twig was a shred of dark, coarse fabric. It looked incredibly old, its weave unfamiliar. As Lore reached for it, the fabric seemed to shimmer and then, impossibly, crumble into fine, gray dust that scattered in the slight breeze. "Did you see that?" Static breathed, his camera already recording. Lore stared at her empty fingers, then at the spot where the fabric had been. It was real, for a moment. A cold draft, smelling faintly of damp earth and something vaguely like old, decaying paper, swirled around them, though the air beyond this small pocket was still. Then they heard it, a low, resonant voice, seeming to come from all around them and nowhere at once. It wasn't a shout, but it carried an undeniable weight of authority, of damnation. "The unrighteous seek signs, but no sign shall be given them, save the sign of the prophet Jonah's." The voice was deep, sonorous, laced with an archaic cadence. It was the voice of a preacher delivering a sermon, but filled with a cold, unyielding condemnation. Static spun around, his recorder extended. "Where it coming from?" Lore stood frozen, her eyes wide. "The gaunt preacher," she whispered. "The descriptions in the old texts. A tall figure, often seen near places of judgment or tragedy before the Paris Creek vanishing." The voice continued, each word a hammer blow. "For as Jonah's was 3 days and 3 nights in the whale's belly, so shall the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth." A shadow detached itself from the deeper gloom beneath the twisted pine. It was impossibly tall, impossibly thin, its form vaguely human but elongated, distorted. It wore what looked like a long, dark coat, and though its features remained obscured in shadow, a sense of implacable will emanated from it. The gaunt preacher. It took a slow, deliberate step towards them. It made no sound as it moved, gliding over the uneven forest floor. Static backed away, fumbling with his camera settings. Infrared, nothing, full spectrum, still indistinct. The preacher raised a hand, long, skeletal fingers emerging from the shadowy sleeve. It didn't point at them, but rather towards the main camp. Woe unto thee, Chorazin! Woe unto thee, Bethsaida! For if the mighty works which were done in you had been done in Tyre and Sidon, they would have repented long ago in sackcloth and ashes. The air crackled with an unseen energy. The temperature dropped sharply. Lore felt a profound despair wash over her, an echo of ancient sorrow and judgment. It wasn't just a ghostly manifestation, it was an emotional assault. It's projecting, Lore gasped, clutching her chest. The feelings, they're not mine. The gaunt preacher took another step. Its shadowy face seemed to turn towards them, though no eyes were visible. A low whisper, directly into their minds rather than through the air, slithered. Interlopers, you pry into sorrows not your own. The narrative is set, the players chosen. Static felt a cold dread grip him. This was not a residual haunting. This was interactive and hostile. We're not part of your story, Static said, his voice surprisingly firm, though his insides were churning. The preacher's form seemed to flicker, to grow slightly larger. All are part of the story eventually. Some are merely recalcitrant. Suddenly, from the direction of the camp, a piercing scream. Then another. The gaunt preacher tilted its head, a slow, deliberate movement. The flock scatters, the shepherd is needed. With a final, lingering gaze that promised future attention, the shadowy figure receded, melting back into the darkness beneath the twisted pine until it was indistinguishable from the natural gloom. The coldness lessened, the oppressive weight lifted slightly, but the echo of its voice and the mental whisper remained. Static and Lore didn't speak for a long moment. The sounds of panic from the camp grew louder. What was that about players chosen? Static finally asked, his voice shaky. Lore swallowed hard. I don't know, but it saw us as more than just witnesses. Interlopers. She looked towards the camp. We need to see what happened. They found chaos. Campers were running, counselors were shouting. Skip was pale-faced, trying to corral a group of terrified children. What's going on? Lore demanded. It was awful, one boy sobbed. The swings, they started moving by themselves, and the merry-go-round, it spun so fast, and there were faces in the blur. Another child, a girl with wide, terrified eyes, added, and the sand in the sandbox. It made a big hand. It tried to grab Tommy. The camp director, Skip, was flustered, trying to maintain order. Just overactive imaginations. A sudden gust of wind, that's all. But his eyes darted nervously towards the playground, where the swings still swayed gently, out of sync with the light breeze. Static and Lore exchanged a look. The gaunt preacher hadn't been addressing them alone. It had been a diversion, or perhaps a display of its influence. While it confronted them, its power was manifesting elsewhere, terrorizing the younger, more vulnerable campers. Later that night, long after an uneasy calm had been restored to Camp Hollowbrook, Static reviewed his footage. The image of the gaunt preacher was frustratingly indistinct, a humanoid silhouette of deeper black against the darkness. But the audio of its sermon, its mental whisper, those were chillingly clear. It's escalating, Static said, hunched over his laptop in the boathouse. The small screen illuminated his intense, worried face. Lore sat beside him, her journal open to a new page, a sketch of the twisted pine taking shape. It knows we're investigating. The marked child showed us a path. The preacher warned us off. They're aware of us, static, deeply aware. The narrative is set. The players chosen, static quoted. What narrative? What players? Lore looked out over the dark, still water of the lake. The Paris Creek vanishing. What if it wasn't just a disappearance? What if it was a story that replays? And what if it needs an audience? Or worse, participants? A new alert beeped softly from Static's phone, one of the motion sensors he'd placed near the creek bed. Movement, Static announced, his voice tight, near where we saw the cabin. He pulled up the live feed from the tiny camera associated with that sensor. The image was grainy, night vision casting the scene in shades of green and black. The creek bed was empty. Then slowly from the right side of the frame something moved into view. Not a spectral image this time. Solid, small. It was the marked child. It stood silently for a moment, then turned its ashen-marked face directly towards the hidden camera. It raised its hand and pointed, just as before. But this time, it wasn't pointing towards a vague spot in the woods. It was pointing directly at the camera, at them. Then the feed went dead. Static tried to reconnect, but the sensor was offline, completely unresponsive. It knows about the cameras, Static whispered, a new level of unease creeping into his voice. It found it, and it's showing us. It can interact with my tech. Lore stared at the blank screen. It's not just showing us a path anymore, Static. I think it's leading us, deliberately, and the preacher, he's trying to scare us away from it. A terrifying thought began to form in Static's mind. Two entities, seemingly from the same historical event but with different approaches. One luring, one threatening. Were they in opposition, or were they playing different roles in the same horrifying play? The path the marked child had shown them, the one that vanished. Static had a sinking feeling it would reappear soon, and this time the invitation would be far more insistent. Chapter 3: The Shifting Ground. The following day was thick with unspoken tension. Camp Hollowbrook's administration, spearheaded by a flustered director Skip, dismissed the previous evening's playground phenomena as a mass imaginative episode triggered by campfire stories. Counselors were instructed to redouble efforts on positive, grounding activities. The campers, however, whispered. They avoided the playground. Their laughter was brittle. Static and Lore moved through the enforced cheerfulness like ghosts themselves, their awareness of the camp's undercurrents setting them apart. The offline sensor near Paris Creek was a stark reminder. They were being watched, their methods analyzed by an unseen intelligence. "It's a game of cat and mouse," Static muttered, fiddling with a new device, a directional antenna he hoped could pick up localized energy signatures without requiring physical sensor placement. They were sitting on the edge of the archery range, the safest, most open space they could find for a private conversation. The marked child lures, the preacher threatens. One wants us to follow, the other wants us to flee. Lore traced patterns in the dust with a twig. Or they both want the same thing, just using different tactics. What if the preacher's threats are designed to make the marked child's invitation seem like the less dangerous option, a way to guide us towards something specific? Static considered this. The complexity of the haunting was far beyond simple residual energy. It suggested intent, strategy. The narrative, he said. The preacher mentioned a narrative. If Paris Creek is a replaying story, what role do we play? Are we meant to be victims, witnesses, or something else? The only way to find out is to follow the next breadcrumb, Lore stated, her gaze steady. But we do it on our terms as much as possible. We need to be prepared for whatever that path leads to. Their chance came sooner than expected. That afternoon, during a mandatory Camp Unity scavenger hunt, another of Skip's attempts to restore normalcy, Lore's team was assigned a clue that led them near the western boundary, close to the old creek. Static, having subtly engineered his own team's route, was not far behind. As Lore's group searched for a hidden token near a cluster of birch trees, she felt it. A sudden drop in temperature, the familiar scent of wood smoke and damp earth. The air shimmered. "Guys, over here!" One of her teammates shouted, oblivious, having found the scavenger hunt clue. But Lore was looking past him, towards the creek bed. The path was there. It hadn't just reappeared. It seemed to have been waiting. Darker than the surrounding woods, it snaked away from the creek, a distinct trail where moments before there had been only tangled undergrowth. It seemed to pulse faintly with an inner darkness. Static arrived, his own team trailing behind him, feigning interest in a nearby bird's nest. His eyes met Lore's. He gave a subtle nod. The path. "I think I left my water bottle back there," Lore announced to her group, gesturing vaguely towards the creek. "I'll catch up." Static similarly excused himself from his team. "Dropped my compass. Won't be a sec." The other campers, absorbed in the thrill of the hunt, barely registered their departure. Together, Static and Lore approached the manifested trail. It was more defined this time, the ground strangely smooth, almost worn, as if by the passage of many feet over a long period, yet it had not existed minutes ago. The trees lining it seemed to lean inwards, their branches creating a tunnel-like effect. "EMF readings are stable but high," Static reported, his voice low. His new directional antenna was pointed down the path. "There's a strong energy signature emanating from somewhere deep within." "It feels different this time," Lore murmured, her hand hovering over the entrance to the path. "Less like an echo, more like an open door." Static took a deep breath. "Ready?" Lore nodded. "As I'll ever be." They stepped onto the shifting path. Instantly, the sounds of the camp, the distant shouts of children, the counselors' whistles vanished. A profound silence enveloped them, broken only by the crunch of their own footsteps on the strangely compacted earth. The light filtering through the canopy above grew dimmer, imbued with an unnatural twilight hue. The path twisted and turned, deeper into woods that felt older, more primal than the familiar grounds of Camp Hollowbrook. The trees here were gnarled, ancient, their bark like wrinkled skin. Strange fungi, glowing faintly with a pale, sickly luminescence, clung to their trunks. "The camp can't be more than half a mile that way," Static said, pointing back over his shoulder. But when he looked, the path behind them had changed. It was no longer clear. The trees seemed to have closed in, obscuring their entry point. Or it was. Lore consulted the compass on her wrist. The needle spun erratically. "We're cut off, or the rules of space are different here." The path continued, an undeniable conduit through the increasingly alien landscape. They walked for what felt like an hour, though the quality of light remained unchanged, a perpetual dusk. The silence was broken by occasional, unsettling noises, a skittering in the undergrowth just out of sight, a mournful sigh carried on a breeze that didn't stir the leaves, the distant crack of a falling branch where no tree seemed to be. Suddenly, Static stopped. He held up a hand. "Listen." Faintly ahead of them they heard it, a rhythmic thumping, followed by a chorus of low, guttural chanting. It was the sound Static had captured on his EVP recorder, but clearer now, more defined, more menacing. They proceeded with greater caution, the sounds growing louder. The path began to descend, leading them into a shallow, bowl-like depression. Through the trees they saw flickering orange light, a fire. As they neared the edge of the depression, they crouched behind a thicket of thorny bushes. Below them was a small clearing. In its center, a bonfire blazed, casting dancing shadows on a ring of crude, lean-to structures that looked like the Paris Creek settlement they had seen in the spectral replay. But these structures were not translucent. They looked solid, real. And the figures around the fire were not ghostly. There were perhaps a dozen of them, clad in rough, homespun clothing of a bygone era. Their movements were jerky, unnatural. They circled the fire, their heads bowed, their voices raised in the unsettling chant. "This isn't a replay," Static whispered, his voice tight with disbelief. "This is present." Lore's eyes were wide with a mixture of fear and awe. "Or we've stepped into the past, fully." One figure, taller than the others, detached itself from the circle and approached the fire. It wore a long, dark coat. Even from this distance, the elongated silhouette was unmistakable. The gaunt preacher. He raised his hands and the chanting stopped. He began to speak, his voice the same resonant, damning tone they'd heard before, but now it was not a disembodied sound. It came directly from the figure. He spoke of sin, of a tainted land, of a necessary sacrifice to appease an old, hungry power that resided beneath the soil. His words were filled with a terrifying conviction. As he spoke, another figure emerged from one of the lean-tos, small, child-sized. It moved with the same jerky unnaturalness as the others, the marked child. It carried something in its hands, a crudely made wooden doll. The preacher gestured towards the child. "The innocent lamb, offered to cleanse the tainted ground. Its purity shall be our salvation from the hunger below." The settlers around the fire let out a collective, eerie moan of assent. Static and Lore watched in horror. This wasn't just a replaying event. It was a ritual, seemingly about to unfold. And the marked child, the entity that had lured them here, was apparently its intended victim. "This is what disappeared them," Lore breathed, her knuckles white as she gripped a branch. "They weren't taken by an outside force. They did it to themselves, or to each other. The preacher pointed towards a large, flat stone near the fire. The marked child was led towards it, its small form unresisting, almost doll-like in its passivity. "We have to do something," Static hissed, his instinct to observe warring with a desperate urge to intervene. But what could they do against a dozen fanatics and a powerful, spectral entity? As if sensing their presence, or perhaps their conflict, the marked child, now standing beside the stone, slowly turned its head. Its ashen-marked face, clearer now in the firelight, fixed directly on their hiding place. There was no fear in its eyes, only a deep, unreadable emptiness. It raised a hand, not in a point this time, but in a beckoning gesture, inviting them closer. At the same moment, the gaunt preacher paused his sermon. His shadowy head swiveled, looking directly at their thicket. A low growl, like stones grinding together, rumbled from his direction. The audience arrives. The narrative demands its witnesses. The mental whisper was stronger now, colder. The ground beneath Static and Lore began to tremble. Not violently, but with a subtle, nauseating tremor. The thorny bushes around them seemed to writhe, their thorns elongating, glistening. The shifting path they had followed into the clearing began to dissolve behind them, the trees closing in, the way back vanishing. "It's a trap," Static realized, his voice strained. "It was always a trap. The child, the preacher, they're working together." The settlers around the fire turned as one, their faces in the flickering light disturbingly blank, their eyes reflecting the flames like animals. They began to advance, slowly, purposefully, towards Static and Lore's hiding place. The gaunt preacher watched, his form seeming to swell in the firelight. The marked child remained by the stone, its gaze still fixed on them, its tiny hand still beckoning. There was no escape back along the path. The woods around them were now a solid, impenetrable wall of ancient trees and grasping thorns. Their only way out was forward, into the clearing, into the heart of the horrifying ritual. The shifting path had delivered them precisely where its architects intended. Chapter 4: The Heart of the Hollow. The circle of settlers tightened, their blank, firelit faces an unnerving tableau of lost humanity. Their movements were synchronized, less like individual people and more like puppets controlled by a single, malevolent will. The rhythmic thumping from some unseen drum resumed. A dull heartbeat under the preacher's continued, chilling oration about absolution through sacrifice. Static's mind raced. His equipment, his meticulous plans for observation, all felt laughably inadequate against this tangible, unfolding horror. The shifting path had not just led them to a replay. It had thrust them into the event itself, the boundaries between past and present, observer and participant, dissolving like mist. "Lore, we need to move," Static urged, his voice a low hiss. "Staying here, we're cornered." Lore's face was pale, but her eyes held a grim determination. "Forward is the only way that isn't instant death by them." She nodded towards the advancing settlers. "The child beckoned us. The preacher called us witnesses. There's a role they expect us to play." "I'm not keen on finding out what it is," Static muttered, but he knew she was right. Hesitation now would be fatal. They broke from the cover of the thorny thicket, not towards the menacing circle of settlers, but angling towards the edge of the clearing, hopping to skirt the main group. Their sudden appearance caused a momentary pause in the settlers' advance. Their blank gazes swiveled, tracking the teenagers. The gaunt preacher, however, remained focused on the stone altar and the marked child, his voice rising in fervor. The blood of the innocent, a balm upon the wounds of this defiled earth. Let the old ones drink deep and be satisfied. As Static and Lore moved, the very ground beneath them seemed to resist. The air grew thick, like wadding through water. Each step was an effort. The faint, sickly sweet scent of the glowing fungi intensified, making Static's head spin. A settler, a gaunt woman with straw-like hair and eyes that were pits of shadow, broke from the circle, her movements unnervingly swift. She lunged, her fingers crooked into claws. Static sidestepped, his backpack catching on a low branch. He stumbled, his primary recording unit clattering to the ground. Lore didn't hesitate. She grabbed a hefty, fallen branch and swung it hard, connecting with the woman's side. There was a sickening, dull thud, but the woman barely flinched, only grunting before turning her shadowed eyes towards Lore, a low growl issuing from her throat. These were not normal people. Pain seemed a foreign concept. "Static, your recorder," Lore yelled, fending off another lunge from the woman. Static scrambled for the device. The casing was cracked, but the indicator lights still flickered. He snatched it up, his heart pounding. That recorder held everything, their only objective proof. More settlers were closing in, their chanting growing louder, more discordant. The path to the far side of the clearing, their only hope for finding some other way out of this bowl-like depression, was shrinking. The marked child, still standing by the sacrificial stone, turned its head slightly, its gaze unwavering. It raised its small hand again, the ashen print stark against its pale skin, and pointed towards a narrow gap between two of the crude lean-tos on the far side of the clearing. An escape route, or another layer of the trap. The gaunt preacher mid-sermon faltered for a microsecond. A flicker of something, annoyance, crossed whatever passed for his features. He had not intended this deviation. The narrative was being challenged. "That way," Lore shouted, spotting the gap the child indicated. She shoved the gaunt woman back with a desperate burst of strength and sprinted towards it. Static followed, dodging another grasping hand. The settlers, disoriented by this unexpected maneuver, milled for a moment before resuming their pursuit, their movements still eerily coordinated. They reached the gap between the lean-tos. It was a narrow passage, barely wide enough for one person, smelling of damp earth and decay. As they squeezed through, the sounds of the ritual, the chanting, the preacher's voice became slightly muffled. The passage opened into a small, enclosed area behind the settlement, a sort of refuse pit. Bones, animal, and disturbingly, some that looked human were scattered amongst broken pottery and rotting vegetation. The ground here was soft, almost boggy. And in the center of this small, fetid space was a hole. It wasn't a well. It was a jagged, dark aperture in the earth, roughly circular, about 5 feet across. No light penetrated its depths. A faint, cool breeze carrying an ancient charnel scent emanated from it. The source of the thumping drumbeat seemed to be directly below. "This is it," Lore breathed, her voice awed and horrified. "The hunger below. This is what they're sacrificing to." Static approached the edge cautiously, aiming his recorder's microphone towards the opening. The EMF readings on his handheld device went wild, the needle slamming against its stop. The energy signature. It's immense, unfathomably old. Suddenly, the marked child was there, standing silently at the edge of the pit, on the opposite side from them. It hadn't made a sound as it approached. It looked at them, then gestured towards the dark hole with its chin. Its expression, if it could be called that, was unreadable. Was it telling them to jump, to investigate? Before they could process, the gaunt preacher's voice boomed from the entrance of the passage they'd just exited. He stood there, silhouetted against the firelight from the clearing, his form seeming to fill the entire opening. "The offering strays, the witnesses meddle, the narrative will be fulfilled." He advanced into the small, enclosed space. He was larger here, closer, his shadowy presence more terrifying. The settlers were crowding behind him, their blank faces peering through the gap. There was nowhere to run. They were trapped between the advancing preacher and his cultists, and the gaping, black hole in the earth. The marked child took a step back from the pit, then another, its gaze still on Static and Lore. It held up the crude wooden doll it carried. Then, with a deliberate, almost ritualistic movement, it tossed the doll into the black hole. There was no splash, no sound of impact. The doll simply vanished into the darkness. A deep, resonant sigh seemed to issue from the hole, a sound that vibrated in their chests. The thumping drumbeat intensified, faster, more urgent. The ground trembled more noticeably. The gaunt preacher paused, his head tilting as if listening. A look of satisfaction perhaps flickered across his shadowy face. "The offering is made," he intoned, though it was the doll, not the child. Or was the doll a conduit, a symbol? The marked child then did something unexpected. It looked directly at Static, then at the recorder in his hand. It pointed at the device, then again at the hole. It wants me to record it," Static said, bewildered, "or throw the recorder in." Lore shook her head. "No, it's showing you what it is, the doll. It was a representation. The child, as it appears to us, might be too an echo, a vessel, the real entity, or its core, might be down there." She looked at the pit with dawning comprehension. Paris Creek. They weren't just sacrificing to something. They were trying to feed a part of themselves they'd somehow trapped or that was trapped with them. The preacher took another step. "The vessel is unimportant. The essence endures. The hunger must be sated." The settlers behind him began to chant again, a low, mournful dirge. Static felt a strange compulsion. The marked child's gaze was intense, insistent. He held out his recorder, aiming its lens and microphone towards the dark aperture. "If this is what you want." As he did, a wave of dizziness washed over him. The air shimmered. The sounds of the settlers, the preacher, the thumping drum, all seemed to recede, replaced by a cacophony of whispers, too many to distinguish, ancient and sorrowful. He saw, not with his eyes but in his mind, a fleeting series of images, faces contorted in fear and madness, crude symbols drawn in blood, a landscape that was writhing, alive, and deeply wrong. He felt an immense, crushing weight of centuries of suffering, of a consciousness trapped and slowly going insane in the dark. The marked child nodded slowly, as if static had understood. Then the ground gave a violent lurch. Cracks appeared around the edge of the pit, widening rapidly. The lean-tos at the edge of the clearing began to groan and tilt. The gaunt preacher stumbled, his spectral form flickering wildly. For the first time, a hint of something other than cold certainty in his voice. The foundations, they break. The narrative, it unravels. The settlers shrieked, a chorus of genuine terror replacing their blank chanting. Some fell into the widening cracks. Others clawed at the earth, trying to scramble away. The marked child remained steadfast by the pit, its small form an anchor in the chaos. It looked at Static and Lore, then pointed towards a section of the enclosing woods that was now, improbably, thinning. Trees were falling, not towards them, but away, as if the earth itself was creating an escape route. Another tremor, stronger this time. The pit let out a sound like a colossal intake of breath. The air pressure changed, making their ears pop. "This whole place is coming apart," Lore yelled over the din. "That path, it's our only chance." Static, still reeling from the mental images, nodded. He clutched his recorder, its red light still blinking. He had captured something, something vital. They scrambled towards the newly formed opening in the woods, away from the collapsing settlement, the shrieking settlers, and the terrifying enigma of the pit. As they reached the tree line, Static risked a glance back. The gaunt preacher was struggling, his form becoming translucent, parts of him dissolving like smoke. He reached out a hand, not in threat, but as if grasping for something lost. It was not meant to end this way. His voice was a faint whisper, lost in the roar of the collapsing earth. The marked child stood at the very edge of the widening chasm, looking down into the darkness. Then it slowly turned its head and looked directly at Static. It raised one small hand, the ashen print stark. It didn't wave. It didn't beckon. It simply held the gesture for a moment, acknowledgement, or perhaps farewell. Then the ground beneath it gave way, and the marked child, the last remnant of Paris Creek's sorrow, slid silently into the hungry darkness below. The pit yawned wide, swallowing the last vestiges of the settlement. Then, with a final, shuddering groan, the earth began to still. Static and Lore plunged into the woods, following the improbable escape route, the sounds of destruction fading behind them. They didn't know where this new path led, but anywhere was better than the heart of Camp Hollowbrook's cursed history. The narrative, it seemed, had indeed unraveled, and they, the interlopers, the witnesses, were somehow, impossibly, still alive. Chapter 5. The Lingering Static. The path away from the collapsing hollow was not a shifting path. It was rough, uneven, tearing at their clothes and scratching their skin as they scrambled through dense, resisting undergrowth. It felt like the woods themselves were trying to hold them back, reluctant to release them from the horrors they'd witnessed. Behind them, the sounds of destruction faded into an unnerving silence, deeper than any they had experienced before. Static and Lore ran until their lungs burned and their legs ached, driven by adrenaline and the primal need for distance. The quality of light gradually changed, the perpetual twilight of the hollow giving way to the familiar, late afternoon sun filtering through the pines of Camp Hollowbrook. When they finally stumbled out of the dense woods, they found themselves near the camp's disused archery range, the same place where their partnership had truly begun. It felt like a lifetime ago. They collapsed onto the sun-dappled grass, gasping for breath. For several minutes neither spoke, the enormity of what they had experienced settling upon them. The camp sounds, distant shouts, the clang of a horseshoe, a tinny pop song from someone's radio were jarringly normal, a stark contrast to the abyss they had just escaped. "Is it over?" Laura finally managed, her voice hoarse. Static looked at his recorder. The casing was badly cracked, one microphone was bent, but the red recording light still pulsed. "I have it, I have," whatever that was. He felt a profound exhaustion, not just physical, but mental, spiritual. The images he'd seen, the sorrow he'd felt when pointing the recorder into the pit, they were seared into his memory. The preacher, the settlers, the child, Lore murmured, staring up at the indifferent blue sky. All gone, the ground just swallowed them. "The narrative unraveled," Static quoted the preacher's last, fading words. "Maybe the land finally rejected the loop, or maybe the child. Maybe it wanted an end, and it used us to achieve it." Lore sat up, her expression troubled. "It pointed us to the pit. It wanted you to record what was in there. It showed us the way out. It wasn't just a victim, Static. It was an agent. It orchestrated its own release and ours." The implications were staggering. The entity they knew as the marked child, perhaps the collective consciousness of the Paris Creek victims or something even older, had manipulated events over centuries, replaying its tragedy, waiting. Waiting for what? For someone with the tools to perceive its true nature. For someone to bear witness not just to the horror but to its core. They made their way back to the main camp, a disheveled, traumatized pair. No one seemed to have noticed their prolonged absence during the chaotic end of the scavenger hunt. Director Skip was still trying to manage the fallout from the playground incident, his patience wearing thin. The world of Camp Hollowbrook, for everyone else, was still one of misplaced hair ribbons and scraped knees. Static and Lore said nothing of what they'd seen. Who would believe them? They were the investigator duo, the weird kids obsessed with ghosts. Their tale would be dismissed as fantasy, a story concocted to explain their muddy clothes and wild eyes. That evening, in the relative privacy of the boathouse, Static carefully transferred the data from his damaged recorder to his laptop. The video footage from the hollow was chaotic, filled with jerky movements and the glare of the fire. The images of the settlers were blurred, the preacher a shifting column of shadow. But the audio was a different story. The preacher's sermons were chillingly clear. The settlers chanting, a discordant, mournful wave of sound. And then there was the recording from the pit. When Static played it back, the boathouse seemed to grow cold. The initial segment was a blast of multi-layered whispers, a torrent of human suffering. But as he applied filters, trying to isolate individual frequencies, something else emerged. Beneath the human anguish there was a deeper sound, a vast, sighing presence, ancient and unknowable. It wasn't speech, not in any human sense. It was the sound of immense, patient hunger, the sound of the earth itself dreaming a dark dream. Lore listened, her hand gripping Static's arm. That's the hunger below. That's what they were feeding. It's not gone, Static said, his voice barely a whisper. The settlement, the entities as we knew them, they're gone, but that's still there, underneath everything. The realization hit them with the force of a physical blow. The destruction of the Hollow wasn't an end. It was, perhaps, merely a resetting. The land had purged the surface manifestation, but the root of the horror remained. The last few days at Camp Hollowbrook passed in a blur. Static and Lore kept to themselves, the shared trauma forging an unbreakable, unspoken bond. They watched the other campers, the counselors, going about their summer routines, and felt like they were seeing a play, a thin veneer of normalcy stretched taut over an abyss. Static tried to use his directional antenna to get readings from the area of the former hollow, but the woods were now impenetrably dense in that direction. The land had healed its scar with unnatural speed, or perhaps simply hidden it again. There were no anomalous EMF readings, no cold spots, no strange sounds. Just an unnerving, profound silence from that quarter of the woods. On the last day of camp, as parents arrived and duffel bags were loaded into cars, Static and Lore found a quiet moment by the lake. "What do we do with this?" Lore asked, gesturing towards Static's laptop which held the recordings. "The world needs to know, doesn't it, what's really out there, what's under our feet?" Static looked out over the sparkling water, the cheerful chaos of departure unfolding around them. Who would listen? Who would believe it wasn't a hoax? We have no physical evidence besides this audio. The hollow is gone. The path is gone. He thought of the marked child's final, knowing gaze. It hadn't asked for its story to be told. It had asked for its essence to be witnessed, acknowledged, and perhaps in its own way to be set free from the repeating cycle of the surface tragedy. The hunger below, however, was a different matter. "Maybe some things," Static said slowly, "aren't meant to be widely known. Maybe some doors are best left unopened." He had started this summer seeking proof of the paranormal, eager to share it. Now he harbored a secret too vast, too unsettling for easy dissemination. Lore nodded, a sad understanding in her eyes. Some stories are too big or too dark. As Static's mother called his name, he closed the laptop. He and Lore exchanged a final look. No words were needed. They were the sole keepers of Hollowbrook's deepest secret, a burden and a bond. Driving away from the creaking Camp Hollowbrook sign, Static watched the pines recede in the rearview mirror. He felt a lingering chill despite the summer heat. He glanced at his duffel bag where the laptop was safely stowed. The recordings were there, the whispers, the hunger. He knew with a certainty that settled deep in his bones that this wasn't the end. The static on the recordings was more than just interference. It was an echo of something vast and patient. And sometimes, late at night when the world was quiet, he thought he could still hear it, a faint, sighing whisper from the deep, dark places of the earth. The hunger remained, and it was always listening. Chapter 6. the unseen audience. Years passed. Static, or rather, the young man he became, who answered to his given name now but still felt like static inside, went to college, studied computer science, and tried to build a normal life. Lore pursued folklore and history, her quiet intensity undiminished. They stayed in touch, their correspondence infrequent but laden with unspoken understanding. The events at Camp Hollowbrook were a shared shadow, a defining experience that shaped their view of the world. Static never released the recordings. He kept them locked away, backed up on multiple encrypted drives. Occasionally, late at night, when a particular kind of stillness fell, he would listen to fragments, the preacher's condemnations, the settler's mournful chants, and always the vast, sighing hunger from the pit. Each listening renewed the chill, the sense of standing on the edge of an abyss. He tried once to write an anonymous paper, a theoretical piece on localized dimensional anomalies and psychoacoustic imprints, using heavily veiled allusions to Hollowbrook. It was dismissed by the academic journals he sent it to as speculative fiction. The world, it seemed, was not ready for, or perhaps actively resisted, such truths. Lore in her research found other stories. Faded newspaper clippings from the late 19th century mentioning unexplained disappearances near the Hollowbrook region. Older, colonial-era diaries hinting at unsettled ground and whispers from below long before the Paris Creek settlement. The phenomenon at Hollowbrook was ancient, its roots far deeper than one lost colony. The preacher and his flock were just one iteration, one narrative played out upon a stage that had seen many. One autumn, nearly a decade after their summer at Camp Hollowbrook, Static received a cryptic email from Lore. The subject line was simply, "It's stirring." The email contained a link to a small, local news website from a town several hundred miles from Hollowbrook. The story was brief. A remote rural community, nestled in a deep valley, had reported strange occurrences. Unexplained lights, unsettling sounds in the night, a pervasive sense of dread settling over the inhabitants. Animals were spooked. People were having shared, disturbing nightmares. A geologist, quoted briefly, mentioned unusual seismic tremors that didn't match any known fault lines. There was no mention of ghosts, no spectral figures, just a growing, inexplicable unease. Static felt a cold dread creep up his spine. He listened to the Hollowbrook recordings again that night. The final segment, the sound from the pit, it seemed fainter, as if its focus had shifted, its energy drawn elsewhere. Or perhaps it was simply that another part of it was awakening. He called Lore. "You think it's connected?" he asked, no preamble needed. "The patterns," Lore said, her voice tight. "The descriptions of the dread, the animal behavior, the unsettling sounds. It's too similar to the precursor events mentioned in the Paris Creek diaries. Before the preacher, before the visible manifestations." "But Hollowbrook is quiet," Static said. "I have contacts, people who hike there, no unusual reports for years." "Maybe it's not geographically locked," Lore suggested. "Maybe the hunger below isn't one place. Maybe it's a network, veins running through the earth. And what happened at Hollowbrook, our intervention, the unraveling of that specific narrative, maybe it just pushed the pressure elsewhere. Like blocking one steam vent only makes another blow." A horrifying thought occurred to Static. The marked child in its final moments hadn't just acknowledged them, it had imprinted on them. They had been witnesses, yes, but they had also become conduits, however briefly, for the energy of that place, that ancient consciousness. When Static recorded the pit, had he inadvertently linked himself, his senses, to that vast, subterranean awareness? Were they now an unseen audience, attuned to its stirrings, whether they wanted to be or not? The news reports from the remote valley continued for a few weeks, growing stranger, more desperate. Then they stopped. The town's internet went down, phone lines were dead. When outside authorities finally managed to reach it, blocked by sudden rock slides and unnaturally aggressive wildlife, they found the valley empty. Houses undisturbed, food on tables, cars in driveways. No signs of struggle, just gone, another Paris Creek. Another narrative concluded unwitnessed, its players vanished. Static and Lore discussed it in hushed tones over secure lines. The cycle had begun anew elsewhere. The hunger had been fed. The land had claimed another story. They knew, with a chilling certainty, that it would happen again. And again. There was nothing they could do to stop it on a grand scale. They were just two people who had looked too closely into the abyss. But they could watch. They could listen. They could try to understand the patterns, to anticipate where the pressure might build next. Not to intervene, they had learned the folly of that, the danger of becoming enmeshed in the narrative. But perhaps to offer a warning if they could find someone, anyone, who would listen. Camp Hollowbrook remained quiet, a place of manufactured summer joy, its history bulldozed and buried, its deepest secrets dormant once more. But Static and Lore knew. They carried the knowledge, the echo of the whispers, the memory of the shifting paths and the gaunt, judging eyes of entities born of sorrow and the ancient hunger of the earth. Sometimes Static would set up his old, patched-up recorder, its cracked casing a memento. He wouldn't go looking for anomalies. He would just let it run, in the quiet of his apartment, the microphones aimed at nothing in particular. More often than not, it captured only silence. But sometimes, very faintly, if he enhanced the audio just right, pushing his equipment to its limits, he would hear it. A subtle shift in the background noise of the world. A sigh, impossibly deep, impossibly patient. The hunger was still there, and it was always listening, waiting for the next story, waiting for its audience. And they, the investigator duo who had survived one such tale, were now condemned, or perhaps privileged, to be part of that unseen audience, forever attuned to the lingering static of a world far more horrifyingly alive than anyone truly knew. The echoes of Camp Hollowbrook would never truly leave them. The end.